Joseph Stalin dies in Moscow on March 5, 1953. The world holds its breath. Who will rule the Soviet Union? Everyone already knows the answer. Time magazine had called him Stalin's apprentice and successor. Western intelligence agencies confirmed it. Soviet officials expected it. Georgy Malenkov, a colorless bureaucrat. No charisma, no revolutionary history, no personal following. Yet somehow everyone believed he would be the next Stalin. Why was the world so certain? What made them think this invisible man would inherit absolute power? To understand why, we must go back to the beginning. January 8, 1902. Georgy Maximilianovich Malenkov was born in Orenburg, a city in the southern Urals. His father, Maximilian, was a prosperous farmer and railroad official, wealthy enough to afford education, but not wealthy enough to be nobility. His mother, Anastasia, was a blacksmith's daughter. The family was comfortable, respectable, unremarkable. When revolution came in 1917, Malenkov was 15, old enough to understand the world was changing, young enough to believe he could rise in the new order. He graduated from gymnasium just months before the revolution. When civil war erupted, he was drafted into the Red Army in 1919. Not out of ideological fervor, but because it was the winning side. By 1920, he had joined the Communist Party. He was 18 years old, politically neutral, professionally ambitious. In 1921, Malenkov moved to Moscow and entered the prestigious Moscow Higher Technical School to study electrical engineering. Through his partner Valeria Golubtsova, they never officially married, he gained connections to Lenin's old circle. Her mother's sisters, the Nevzorova sisters, had been Lenin's companions in revolutionary study groups in the 1890s. These connections mattered. In 1925, after completing his studies, Malenkov was offered a position in the Organizational Bureau of the Central Committee, the department that managed party personnel records. It was not glamorous work. While revolutionary heroes gave speeches and commanded armies, Malenkov sat in offices maintaining files, card catalogs on 2.5 million party members, records of who joined when, who had been purged, who was promoted. But this work gave him something more valuable than fame, access to information, and invisibility. By the late 1920s, as Stalin consolidated power and began eliminating rivals, Malenkov made himself useful in a specific way. He didn't have opinions. He didn't join factions. He kept records, processed paperwork, and executed orders without questions. When Stalin needed someone to hunt Trotskyists among students at Moscow Higher Technical School, Malenkov led the investigation. When the party needed verification of member documents, Malenkov organized the system. He rose quietly through the bureaucracy, never making himself a threat, never drawing attention, always competently doing what was asked. In 1930, Malenkov became head of the Organizational Bureau in Moscow. By 1934, he controlled personnel for the entire Soviet Union, appointing, transferring, and removing party officials across the country. This position became crucial as Stalin's Great Purge approached. Someone had to manage the logistics of mass terror. Someone had to maintain the lists, process the arrests, coordinate the removal of hundreds of thousands of party members. Malenkov was that someone, efficient, obedient, forgettable. While others were loud revolutionaries with dangerous histories and strong opinions, Malenkov was simply the administrator who made the machine work. Stalin noticed. Stalin's Great Purge began in 1936, following the assassination of Sergei Kirov. What started as elimination of obvious enemies, Trotskyists, old Bolsheviks, suspected traitors, rapidly expanded into systematic terror, targeting anyone who might pose a threat. Someone had to organize this. The NKVD arrested people, but the Communist Party determined who was arrested. That required personnel files, background checks, lists of associates, documentation of connections. Malenkov controlled all of it. In 1934, He became chief aide to Nikolai Yezhov, who chaired the party's Control Commission. When Yezhov became head of the NKVD in 1936 and launched the worst phase of terror, the Yezhovshchina, Malenkov remained at his side. By 1937, Malenkov was deputy to Yezhov. While the NKVD conducted interrogations and executions, Malenkov provided the names, the files, the organizational structure that made mass terror possible. He was sent to Armenia in September 1937. A party official had died suspiciously during interrogation, either jumped or was pushed from a window at the NKVD building, and Stalin suspected the local NKVD of covering it up. Malenkov arrived with Yezhov and conducted a systematic purge. Almost all local leaders arrested. Hundreds of ordinary party members eliminated. A similar mission to Belarus with Yezhov resulted in equally brutal results. After Nikita Khrushchev later exposed Stalin's crimes, one party official reported that Malenkov personally participated in interrogations under torture and the elimination of 3,500 Armenian communists. But Malenkov was not just an executioner. He was a survivor. By 1938, Stalin had grown concerned that the purges had gone too far. The party and military were decimated. Economic production was suffering. Someone needed to be blamed for the excess. That someone was Yezhov. Malenkov, who had been Yezhov's closest aide, smoothly pivoted. He began reporting to Stalin about abuses by NKVD officials. He proposed appointing Lavrentiy Beria to replace Yezhov. Together with Beria, he participated in Yezhov's arrest, which occurred in Malenkov's own office. This was Malenkov's particular skill, sensing when the wind changed and adapting instantly. Yezhov, who had given him power, was now a liability. Malenkov eliminated him without hesitation. By 1939, Malenkov was a member of the Central Committee and secretary controlling party personnel, the position Yezhov had held before his purge. In 1941, he became a candidate member of the Politburo. Soviet historian Roy Medvedev, who wrote extensively about Stalin's inner circle, notes, "What Malenkov did, he did because he was Stalin's intimate. He excelled only as an agent for the leader to whom he gave total devotion." The pattern was established. Malenkov had no ideology, no personal following, and no independent power base. He existed solely to serve Stalin, and that made him perfect for the role. World War II presented new opportunities for him. Stalin created a 5-man state defense committee to manage the Soviet war effort. These members were Stalin himself, Molotov, Beria, Voroshilov, and Malenkov. This placement put Malenkov among the 5 most powerful individuals in the Soviet Union. His responsibilities included supervising aircraft production, overseeing missile development, and managing the early Soviet nuclear program. He proved to be quite competent in these roles. He recruited talented engineers and scientists. He focused on technical skills rather than strict ideological purity. Production subsequently increased. By 1943, he was also in charge of the economic rehabilitation of liberated territories, with just one notable exception. That city was not Leningrad. That particular task was someone else's domain entirely. It belonged to Andrei Zhdanov. Zhdanov had served as Leningrad's party boss during the brutal 900-day siege. He steadfastly remained in the city throughout that ordeal, refusing to abandon his post. After the war concluded, he returned to Moscow as one of Stalin's most influential lieutenants, acting as an ideological enforcer, a cultural overseer, and essentially Stalin's right-hand man. Whereas Malenkov was colorless and pragmatic, Zhdanov was charismatic and highly ideological. While Malenkov worked quietly behind the scenes in offices, Zhdanov actively gave speeches and shaped policy. Where Malenkov possessed no personal following, Zhdanov had cultivated a substantial network of loyal protégés originating from Leningrad. They were complete opposites, and Stalin deliberately played them against each other. In 1946, a significant scandal erupted within the aviation industry. There were widespread production failures and serious mismanagement. Malenkov, who had oversight of aircraft production, was consequently blamed. He was subsequently removed from the Secretariat and temporarily lost his influential position controlling party personnel. Zhdanov's own star began to rise considerably. His trusted lieutenant, Alexei Kuznetsov, then took over Malenkov's crucial personnel role. For a period of 2 years, from 1946 to 1948, it strongly appeared that Zhdanov would become Stalin's chosen successor. This era subsequently became known as the Zhdanovshchina, characterized by severe cultural repression, ideological purification, and Zhdanov's specific vision of a perfect Soviet culture. He aggressively attacked writers, composers, and artists for what he deemed insufficient ideological purity. He infamously called poet Anna Akhmatova half-nun, half-whore. Malenkov, meanwhile, was reassigned to oversee agriculture, which was perpetually the failing sector of the entire Soviet economy. It appeared he had been sidelined into obscurity, but Malenkov had learned the value of patience. And importantly, he had gained a crucial ally. That ally was Beria. Throughout the course of 1947 and into early 1948, Malenkov and Beria quietly collaborated to undermine Zhdanov's influence. They actively exploited every single mistake Zhdanov made and magnified every failure, drawing Stalin's critical attention to problems involving Leningrad officials. In June 1948, relations severely soured between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Zhdanov, who had been responsible for overseeing relations with Eastern European allies, was consequently forced to expel Yugoslavia from the Common Front, which was a deeply humiliating admission of his failure. Stalin then sent Zhdanov on medical leave to a party sanitarium in mid-July 1948, officially for stated health reasons. Unofficially, however, this was a clear signal that he was being deliberately pushed aside. Malenkov triumphantly returned to the Secretariat that very same month. On August 31, 1948, Andrei Zhdanov tragically died. Officially, it was attributed to heart failure, and he was 52 years old. The circumstances surrounding his death were quite suspicious. He had been arguing with associates just before his passing, and his health had deteriorated rapidly. Whether his death was natural, the result of medical neglect, or something more sinister has never been definitively proven. What is certain, however, is that his death removed Malenkov's main rival, and what followed subsequently destroyed everyone associated with Zhdanov. Zhdanov's funeral was a grand and elaborate affair. Stalin himself walked behind the caisson with visible tears in his eyes, making it the most elaborate ceremony since Lenin's death. But within a few months, Zhdanov's entire legacy was being systematically erased. The purge began quietly in early 1949. Malenkov and Beria fabricated charges against Zhdanov's loyal protégés, targeting the Leningrad Party organization that Zhdanov had originally built. The accusations themselves were utterly absurd, including attempts to create a rival Communist Party of Russia, organizing an unauthorized trade fair in Leningrad without Moscow's explicit permission, and claims of voting irregularities at a party conference. Charges included treason, espionage, and Russian nationalism. None of these accusations held any real truth. All of it was meticulously documented by the security services that Beria directly controlled. One by one, Zhdanov's closest associates began to disappear. Alexei Kuznetsov, who had taken Malenkov's previous position in 1946, was arrested. Nikolai Voznesenskiy, a brilliant young Politburo member and head of Gosplan, was removed from his post. Peter Popkov, Zhdanov's successor as Leningrad party boss, simply vanished. The purge then systematically spread throughout the entire Leningrad party apparatus. Thousands were arrested, and hundreds were executed. The entire Leningrad organization, which was one of the most important in the Soviet Union, was effectively decimated. The primary motivation behind this was clear: eliminating any potential power base that might possibly challenge Malenkov's growing position. Malenkov even went so far as to accuse Jewish doctors of poisoning Zhdanov, deliberately playing on Stalin's increasing antisemitism. This was a complete fabrication, which was only exposed after Stalin's death. But at that specific time, it effectively served its intended purpose. The Leningrad affair itself was never officially announced to the public. It remained a quiet, behind-the-scenes purge. There were no public trials, no official announcements, just disappearances processed through the security apparatus. It wouldn't be acknowledged until 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev revealed in his secret speech to the Central Committee that the charges had all been fabrications. Khrushchev specifically identified Beria as the primary organizer of this entire affair. In 1957, he went even further and named Malenkov as one of the chief organizers of the purge. But that significant revelation occurred many years later. In 1949, the Leningrad affair successfully accomplished its primary goal, effectively destroying the only organized faction that might have possibly challenged Malenkov's swift rise. By 1950, Malenkov had successfully eliminated his main rival, destroyed that rival's numerous supporters, and fully consolidated his position as Stalin's closest associate. He controlled personnel appointments across the entire Soviet Union. He supervised key industries. He had earned Stalin's complete trust. Historian Roy Medvedev observes that Malenkov and Beria manufactured the Leningrad affair, which resulted in the arrests of thousands of communists who were associates of Zhdanov. What is certain is that Zhdanov's demise directly led to Malenkov's emergence as one of Stalin's two most intimate associates in power. The aging Stalin, increasingly paranoid, isolated, and physically declining, relied more and more on Malenkov for day-to-day operations. And then came a significant signal that made the entire world believe Malenkov would indeed be the successor. This occurred in October 1952. The 19th Party Congress convened in Moscow, which was the first Congress to be held in 13 years. These Congresses represented the highest formal authority within the Communist Party, and they were held only when Stalin himself deemed it necessary. The crucial question then became, who would give the main report? For decades, this had always been Stalin's own role. The main report defined the party's policy and set its future direction. Demonstrated leadership.
Stalin chose Malenkov.
This was unprecedented. No one except Stalin had delivered the main report since he had consolidated power. Giving it to Malenkov was an unmistakable signal about succession. Western intelligence agencies took note. Time magazine, which had been watching Soviet politics closely, put Malenkov on its cover in 1952, embraced by Stalin, identified as Stalin's apprentice and successor. The magazine's analysis was clear. Malenkov had positioned himself as heir apparent. He held positions no one else did. Member of the Politburo, Secretary of the Central Committee, Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Only Stalin held all three. Malenkov controlled party personnel, supervised key industries, handled day-to-day governance while Stalin's health declined. His name appeared constantly in Soviet media. His photographs stood beside Stalin's at official events. The 19th Congress also restructured Soviet leadership. The Politburo became the Presidium, with composition apparently favoring Malenkov. The Secretariat was enlarged again to his advantage. Every visible signal pointed to Malenkov as designated successor. But signals are not reality. What the world saw was not what Stalin had actually created. Stalin had spent decades perfecting a particular system, never formally designating a successor, always keeping multiple people in competition, ensuring no one accumulated enough independent power to challenge him. Malenkov looked like the heir because Stalin allowed him to look that way. But Stalin had given him no independent power base, no loyal military commanders, no personal following beyond the bureaucracy. Malenkov existed only as Stalin's tool, and Stalin, even in decline, never secured his succession. He kept everyone, Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev, Molotov, competing, uncertain, dependent on his favor. On March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered a massive stroke. For 4 days he lay dying while his closest associates gathered around, waiting. On March 5 he died. The moment everyone had been preparing for arrived, and immediately reality diverged from expectation. March 5, 1953. Within hours of Stalin's death, Malenkov took power. He became premier, head of government, and first secretary of the Communist Party, the two most powerful positions in the Soviet Union. Western newspapers announced Stalin's successor had assumed control. Soviet radio broadcast the new leadership structure with Malenkov at the top. It appeared the transition would be smooth. The heir apparent had become the leader. But behind closed doors, the knives were already out. The other members of the Presidium, particularly Khrushchev, who controlled significant parts of the party apparatus, and Beria, who controlled the secret police, had not spent decades under Stalin to simply hand power to Malenkov. Now, on March 13, 8 days after Stalin's death, Malenkov was forced to request relief from his position as first secretary, keeping only the premiership. Khrushchev took control of the party. The official explanation was Malenkov needed to focus on government administration. The reality? He had been outmaneuvered immediately. What followed was called collective leadership, a polite term for a power struggle. Malenkov remained premier. Khrushchev ran the party. Beria controlled the secret police. Molotov handled foreign affairs. They worked together to eliminate Beria in June 1953. He was arrested and executed by December. But that only intensified the struggle between Malenkov and Khrushchev. Malenkov tried to implement reforms. He proposed shifting resources from heavy industry to consumer goods, producing more food, clothing, and household items for ordinary citizens. He suggested reducing military spending. He stated that nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States was not inevitable. These were reasonable policies. Years later, Khrushchev would implement similar reforms. But in 1953 to 1954, Khrushchev opposed everything Malenkov proposed. Not because the policies were wrong, but because they were Malenkov's. Khrushchev controlled the party apparatus, the provincial bosses, the Central Committee, the machinery that had kept Stalin in power. Malenkov controlled administrative positions. He had no personal following, no loyal commanders, no independent base. He was Stalin's creation, and without Stalin he had nothing. In February 1955, less than 2 years after taking power, Malenkov was forced to resign as premier. He made a public confession about his failures in agricultural policy. He was demoted to deputy chairman, given responsibility for power stations. The successor had lasted 2 weeks with real power. The rest was a slow decline. Why did everyone believe Malenkov would succeed Stalin? Because Stalin made them believe it. The signals, the positions, the public prominence, all deliberately created. But Stalin had never actually given Malenkov the tools to hold power. Loyal followers, independent authority, personal credibility beyond bureaucratic competence. Political scientist Myron Rush, who studied Soviet succession, notes, the failure of Malenkov to retain power demonstrated the difference between appearing to be Stalin's successor and actually having the power to succeed him. Malenkov had spent 30 years becoming the perfect subordinate. He had no opinion Stalin didn't give him, no power Stalin didn't delegate, no existence separate from serving Stalin. The moment Stalin died, Malenkov discovered he was nothing without him. Georgy Malenkov lived another 35 years after losing power. Khrushchev kept him in minor positions until 1957, when Malenkov joined an attempt to oust Khrushchev. The coup failed. He was expelled from the Central Committee. He became manager of a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan. His orders were reportedly ignored by workers. He resigned in humiliation. In 1964, he was expelled from the party entirely. He lived in obscurity in Moscow until his death on January 14, 1988. He was 86 years old, outliving Stalin by 35 years, outliving most of his rivals, but politically dead since 1955. Everyone thought Malenkov was Stalin's successor because Stalin created that illusion. But succession in a dictatorship isn't about who looks like the heir. It's about who has real power when the dictator dies. Malenkov had neither. He was Stalin's creature, competent at serving, incapable of leading. The invisible man who rose up by never presenting himself as a threat became a leader, who then fell down by never presenting himself as a threat. That illusion lasted for exactly 2 weeks.